An old woman in a faded floral dress stepped onto a dazzling stage, the crowd shifting in their seats, smirking in anticipation. Cameras zoomed in to capture the spectacle they thought would unfold another harmless humiliation. A brief, forgettable sideshow, but 4 minutes later, the entire audience was standing cheering, and many wiping tears they couldn't quite explain. What happened between those few minutes shattered every stereotype about age, worth, and dreams deferred. Stay with me, because this is a story you'll carry in your heart longer than you can imagine. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? The morning sunlight poured into the modest apartment in Millfield, Ohio, touching the worn edges of the lace curtains that had framed the windows for nearly 30 years. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee, and on the kitchen table sat today's crossword puzzle half completed. Beatrice Caldwell hunched over it, reading, glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She muttered softly, pen poised. 7 letters, musical term for very loud fortissimo. Her hand moved swiftly, filling in the answer with the kind of certainty that only comes with age and a lifetime of small, quiet certainties. Outside, the world carried on without her as it had every day for years. Children raced to catch school buses. Joggers passed by, heads full of podcasts and playlists. Beatrice, now 68, had slipped into a rhythm that, while comforting, often felt like living inside a loop song. Predictable mornings with coffee and puzzles, afternoons volunteering at the local library, Thursday evenings tucked into the second row of the church choir, harmonizing carefully behind others. Never drawing attention to herself, always blending in, never standing out. She touched the delicate gold music box resting on the end table, a relic from a past life almost too distant to feel real. Once, when the world was young and the sky seemed full of endless possibilities, she had dreamed of singing. Truly singing, not just as part of a group, but as a solo voice standing proud. But dreams are fragile things, easily bruised by careless words. 50 years ago, in the echoing, fluorescent-lit halls of Millfield Community College, Professor James Winters, with his sharp suits and sharper tongue, had sliced through her hopes with surgical precision. "Technically adequate, Miss Jenkins," he had said after her final recital, steepling his fingers like a man pronouncing a sentence. "But utterly forgettable, you lack the spark that separates amateurs from artists." A few cruel syllables dropped casually, carelessly, and a young girl's dreams crumbled quietly inside her chest, hidden even from herself. In the years that followed, Beatrice built a different kind of life, a safe one. She married Richard Caldwell, a kind man with laugh lines and warm hands. Together they had a daughter, Karen. When Richard passed away far too soon, music became a private sanctuary rather than a public ambition. She sang in the shower. She sang over the dishes. She sang to lull Karen to sleep when the nights felt too long and the grief too heavy. But she never stood alone on a stage again. Until now, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the morning stillness. Beatrice blinked, setting down her pen, and answered, "Hello, Mrs. Caldwell." A familiar voice chirped, "It's Martha from choir. Did you see the news? They're holding auditions for America's Spotlight at the convention center next Tuesday." Beatrice laughed, the sound low and self-deprecating. "Martha, those shows aren't for people like us." "Nonsense," Martha protested with the force that startled her. "You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. Even Pastor Williams says so." "I haven't sung solo in, well, I can't even remember when," Beatrice said, twisting the coiled telephone cord around her fingers. Her gaze drifted again to the little music box, the once vivid memory of a teenage girl standing beneath bright stage lights, tugging at her heart. After Martha hung up, the idea lingered like a half-forgotten tune. Beatrice caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for traces of that fearless girl she once was. The face that stared back was kind, but lined familiar, yet foreign. She hummed a few bars, her voice tentative at first, then fuller, richer. It filled the small bathroom, wrapping around the worn tiles, the soft towels, the fading dreams. She closed her eyes, transported back to that high school auditorium before the cruel words, before life rerouted her path. Across town, Martha, undeterred by Beatrice's modesty, uploaded a video clip she had secretly recorded during last Easter's church service. It was a shaky, heartfelt moment. Beatrice stepping in to sing a solo after the lead soprano had fallen ill. Her voice had carried the hymn not with technical bravado, but with a raw, aching authenticity that had moved the entire congregation to tears. 3 days later, when the phone rang again, the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Beatrice hesitated, a coil of anxiety tightening in her chest. Hello, Mrs. Caldwell. This is Ryan Matthews, producer for America's Spotlight. We received a video submission of you singing Amazing Grace. We would be honored to invite you to audition live on next week's show. Beatrice's heart skipped, stuttered. There must be a mistake, she said quickly. I didn't submit anything. Ryan chuckled warmly, masking his true intentions. Well, someone did. And Mrs. Caldwell, we think America would love to see you one song. We'll handle transportation, hotel accommodations, everything. Across town in a sleek production office, Ryan muted his phone and winked at his assistant. Perfect, he mouthed. A senior citizen with a touching backstory, they had found their week's heartfelt elimination. Back in her kitchen, Beatrice's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the receiver tighter. I haven't sung solo in decades, she whispered. All the more reason, Ryan said smoothly. America loves comeback stories. Think about it, inspiring seniors everywhere. After the call ended, Beatrice stood motionless for a long time. Her mind, a whirlwind excitement, dread, doubt. She called Karen, her daughter, now living 3 hours away in Cincinnati. Mom, that's incredible. Karen's voice rang bright and clear through the receiver. You have to do it. I'll look ridiculous, Beatrice murmured, an old woman among teenagers. You'll look brave, Karen countered. Mom, remember what you always told me? Life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage. Beatrice smiled faintly. That's Anais Nin, dear. Well, it's still true. You gave up so much for me after Dad died. Your dreams, your life. Maybe this is your second chance. That evening, Martha arrived at her door carrying a modest bouquet of grocery store flowers. She looked guilty and hopeful all at once. I should have asked your permission, she said, voice cracking, but I couldn't let the world miss hearing you. Beatrice shook her head, half exasperated, half touched. I called them back, she said. I'm going out. Martha let out a squeal of delight that startled the neighbor's cat off the porch railing. Across town, a red flag marked Beatrice's file, SE sympathetic elimination. The decision had already been made, but life in Beatrice herself was not finished. Writing this story yet, the journey to that stage, to that moment of unexpected glory had only just begun. The days leading up to the audition blurred into a strange dream where reality felt both too vivid and too far away. Beatrice found herself doing odd things without thinking, smoothing the same wrinkle out of her floral dress, a dozen times checking and rechecking the small overnight bag she had packed, even though it contained barely more than a nightgown and a Bible. The world outside her apartment bustled with its usual indifference, but inside her heart something fierce and restless had awakened. Pacing, waiting, stirring embers long thought extinguished. The limousine they sent to pick her up was gleaming and absurdly long, like something meant for movie stars or prom queens, not widows from Millfield who carried their dreams folded into old hymnals. The driver, a young man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, opened the door for her with practiced courtesy, but Beatrice caught the slight flicker of surprise in his expression. She wasn't what he had expected, and for a moment she almost turned and fled back into the safety of her tiny kitchen and crossword puzzles. But then she thought of Karen's voice on the phone, strong and proud, and Martha's tear-bright eyes and her own reflection in the mirror that morning. Not glamorous, not perfect, but steadfast, she lifted her chin, adjusted her reading glasses, and stepped into the car. The drive to the city felt endless, a winding ribbon of nerves and anticipation. As they left the quiet suburban streets behind and the skyline grew sharper against the blue April sky, Beatrice clasped her hands together tightly in her lap. She forced herself to hum softly under her breath, Amazing Grace, the old standby, as if the familiar melody could anchor her in the present moment. At the studio, the first thing that hit her was the coldness of the place. Not the temperature, but the atmosphere, a machine built for entertainment, churning through hopefuls and dreams with the efficiency of a meat grinder. Giant screens flashed images of past winners, past sob stories, past spectacles. The walls buzzed with the nervous energy of contestants. Much younger, much shinier than herself. Girls with purple streaks in their hair, and boys with guitars slung across their backs like weapons. A brisk woman with a clipboard met her at the entrance. She barely glanced up as she said, Mrs. Caldwell, right. Follow me, please. Her voice was clipped businesslike, as if Beatrice were another form to be processed rather than a person. Beatrice scurried after her, clutching her handbag like a life preserver. They moved through endless corridors, painted sterile shades of gray, past rooms full of makeup stations, racks of sparkling costumes and frantic stagehands, barking into headsets. Everywhere she looked, people were moving fast, speaking faster. None of them sparing a second glance for the older woman in the simple blue dress with faded flower embroidery. The makeup room was a cacophony of hairdryers' laughter and the chemical scent of hairspray. Beatrice was deposited into a swivel chair under harsh fluorescent lights. A young woman with neon green nails and an immaculate winged eyeliner paused briefly to smile at her before assessing her face with professional detachment. "Let's see what we can do here," the girl said cheerfully, pulling out an array of brushes and compacts. Beatrice sat still, letting the young woman work, feeling more like a canvas than a human being. She watched in the mirror as her features were subtly brightened. Soft pink lipstick, a dusting of blush, a hint of shimmer around her eyes. When the girl finished, she stepped back and beamed. "You look beautiful, age-appropriate, but camera-ready." Beatrice barely recognized herself. There was something sharper in her reflection now. Not youth exactly, but presence. She tucked a strand of silver blonde hair behind her ear and offered a tentative smile. From there, the whirlwind resumed vocal warm-ups in a drafty rehearsal hall, microphone checks, a hurried, almost cursory session with a vocal coach who advised her to think big, sing small, whatever that meant. Beatrice nodded politely and sang a few bars when prompted, but inside she felt like she was walking a tightrope over a chasm of doubt. In the holding area behind the stage, contestants huddled together, buzzing with nervous excitement. Beatrice sat on a battered folding chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, feeling invisible. No one spoke to her, no one sat near her. She was a footnote, a curiosity, a piece of programming carefully slotted between a teenage rock band and a professional opera singer, for maximum emotional whiplash. Ryan Matthews, the producer, swept into the room like a man in charge of his own small kingdom. He wore a headset and an insincere smile as he worked the room, offering last-minute encouragements that sounded suspiciously like commands. When he reached Beatrice, he crouched slightly, placing a paternal hand on her shoulder. "Nervous, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, his tone syrupy. "A little," she admitted, because what else could she say? "That's natural," he said, giving her shoulder a perfunctory squeeze. "Just be yourself. America loves authenticity." She watched him move away, laughing a little too loudly at some young contestant's joke, and she caught the tail end of a conversation he had with another producer. "Perfect sympathy vote," Ryan said, flipping through a clipboard. "She's harmless. Win-win." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She wasn't there to be pitied. She hadn't agreed to this just to be a convenient ratings bump. Before she could spiral too deeply into anger and humiliation, a young woman with purple hair plopped down beside her. Beatrice recognized her from the vocal warm-ups earlier. "Zoe," she thought her name was. "You're the church lady, right?" Zoe asked, not unkindly. Beatrice nodded, offering a faint smile. "Don't let them mess with your head," Zoe said, dropping her voice. "They slot in one older contestant every season for the all factor. It's crap. But that doesn't mean you can't torch the place." Beatrice blinked. "Torch the place," Zoe grinned, flashing a silver lip ring. "Blow them away, make them remember you for the right reasons, not because they expected to feel sorry for you." Before Beatrice could respond, Zoe was called to stage left, leaving a trail of glitter from her boots. Beatrice sat back in her chair, letting the words settle into the cracks of her self-doubt. Maybe she didn't have to play the role they had written for her. Maybe, just maybe, she could rewrite the story. A tap on her shoulder startled her. A harried stage manager with a clipboard and a headset motioned urgently. "Mrs. Caldwell, you're up next." Her mouth went dry. Her palms prickled with sweat. She rose on trembling legs and followed the stagehand through a labyrinth of cables and black curtains until she found herself standing just behind the massive, blinding stage. The host's voice boomed through the speakers, cheerful and booming. "And next, a very special contestant, proof that it's never too late to chase your dreams. Please welcome Beatrice Caldwell." The applause was polite but perfunctory as she swayed onto the stage, her sensible shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. The lights were brutal, erasing everything beyond the first few rows into a hazy blur. Somewhere out there, Karen was watching. Somewhere, Martha was praying. Somewhere deep inside herself, the young girl who had once believed she could be extraordinary stirred, blinking awake. The microphone stand waited tall and impassive. Beatrice took a deep breath. The music would start in just a few seconds. She could already hear the first trembling strings of "At Last" threading into the air. She gripped the microphone and closed her eyes, not from fear, but from something else, from memory. Richard's face floated behind her eyelids, smiling that soft, crooked smile. Karen's tiny hand in hers, trusting and warm, the choir members lifting their voices in harmony around her. All the small, quiet moments of a life well lived, a life of courage that had never asked for applause. She opened her eyes and stepped forward. Not a joke, not a punchline, not a sympathy vote. A woman with a voice and a story and a song to sing. Whatever happened next, she would sing it with everything she had left, and she would set the world on fire. The first notes of the backing track floated into the air. The familiar opening of "At Last," so soft it was almost like a breath, a memory. Beatrice gripped the microphone a little tighter, feeling the texture of it under her fingertips. Cold, solid, real. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, each beat screaming at her to run, but something deeper, stronger, rooted her to that spot. She inhaled carefully, slowly, as Karen had told her over the phone, as Martha had whispered in her ear the night before. Inhale courage, exhale fear. The audience waited in an awkward hush, the polite sort of patience reserved for moments everyone expected to turn uncomfortable. Beatrice could feel the weight of 1,000 assumptions pressing down on her, assumptions about who she was, what she could possibly offer, how quickly she would be forgotten. Somewhere in the first few rows, someone coughed a sharp, nervous sound that echoed in the vast auditorium. A camera shifted on its track, the mechanical whir loud to her ears. Ryan Matthews stood in the wings, arms folded, already mentally filing her away under sympathy clip. She could have faltered then. She could have surrendered to the wave of doubt that had been chasing her all week. But instead, she closed her eyes just for a moment and found him, Richard. Not the memory of him, but the feeling of him, the night of their wedding reception, when the world had been just the two of them, and the music had wrapped around their bodies like a blessing. At last had played then too, the same silvery melody. She had rested her head against his chest, felt the rumble of his laughter, the steady beat of his heart. They had been so young, so sure. Beatrice opened her eyes. She wasn't singing for the producers. She wasn't singing for the cameras or the judges. She wasn't even singing for the audience. She was singing for him, for Karen, for herself. Her voice emerged tentative at first, a filament of sound that quivered in the cavernous space. The first few words nearly got lost among the breathless silence, but she caught them, steadied them, shaped them, and then she sang again, stronger. At last! A ripple passed through the room, a shift so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The polite smiles faded, the camera zoomed closer. Somewhere in the darkness, someone lowered their phone, realizing instinctively that this moment deserved more than a shaky recording. Her voice wasn't polished or flashy. It was raw, rich, textured by decades of living. It carried weight, the ache of lost love, the quiet joys of a life well lived, the nights spent singing lullabies to a restless child, the mornings folding laundry with gospel hymns on the radio. Every note trembled, not with fear but with memory, with truth. On the second verse, something inside her loosened. Beatrice let go of the microphone stand, lifting one hand to gesture slightly, emotion so natural it surprised even her. Her shoulders straightened. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She was expanding, filling the space with her presence, her history, her defiance. In the control room, Ryan Matthews leaned forward in his chair, frowning. This wasn't the train wreck they had planned. The director beside him was already barking into his headset. Get the judge reaction shots. Get the wide crowd shots. Something's happening. The judges seated beneath the blazing lights were visibly moved. The female judge, a pop singer known more for her biting critiques than her compassion, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The veteran producer leaned back in his seat, shaking his head, slowly, lips parted in disbelief. Even the youngest judge, a former boy band star famous for his smirking bravado, sat stunned, his hands motionless in his lap. In the audience, Martha sat clutching Karen's hand so tightly their knuckles were white. Tears streamed unchecked down Martha's face while Karen could only stare breathless at the woman she had thought she knew, but now realized she had never fully seen Beatrice reach the climax of the song, the moment when Etta James had always let her voice soar into the heavens. Beatrice didn't try to imitate that. Instead, she did something braver. She stayed grounded, pulling the notes deep from her chest, singing not with flash, but with feeling so potent it became a tidal wave sweeping over the audience and leaving nothing untouched. My lonely days are over, her voice cracked slightly on over. But somehow that imperfection made the moment all the more devastating, more real. She wasn't performing. She was telling a story of waiting, of losing, of loving, of surviving. The final note lingered hanging in the charged air. For a fraction of a second, there was only silence, thick and holy, as if even applause would feel sacrilegious. Then from somewhere in the front, a single pair of hands began clapping. The sound was tentative at first, a small hopeful sound, then another and another, until the entire auditorium erupted, a tidal wave of applause crashing against the stage. Beatrice stood frozen, eyes wide, her hands trembling at her sides. The standing ovation rolled toward her like a rising tide. People clamored to their feet, shouting, cheering, whistling. The judges rose too, one after the other, their faces radiant with astonishment, and something else, something like gratitude. The host, a handsome man in a velvet blazer, hurried onto the stage, his microphone forgotten in his excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice breaking slightly, that was not what anyone expected, Mrs. Caldwell. You have just reminded every single person here why music matters. The pop singer judge stepped forward, clutching her microphone tightly. Her voice wobbled as she spoke. Beatrice, you didn't just sing that song, you lived it. And because you lived it, we lived it too. Thank you, the veteran producer leaned into his microphone. I have heard hundreds of renditions of At Last over the decades. Yours was unforgettable. Not because it was perfect, because it was true. That kind of honesty, it's rare, it's sacred. The youngest judge, normally so quick with sarcastic remarks, simply wiped his eyes and said, "Respect." Ryan Matthews watched the monitors in silence, his stomach twisting. This wasn't the narrative he had built. This wasn't the controlled, manipulable moment he had engineered. This was something wild and real, and it was beautiful on stage. Beatrice found her voice again, small and stunned. "Thank you," she said into the microphone. Her voice cracked, but the crowd roared louder, refusing to let her slip away quietly. The host turned back to the audience, beaming. "I think we all know Mrs. Caldwell deserves a place in the next round." The response was deafening, unanimous. Backstage, as she was led away from the roaring auditorium lights, Beatrice stumbled slightly. Karen was there, rushing to catch her, enveloping her in a hug so fierce it almost knocked her off her feet. "You did it, Mom," Karen whispered into her ear, voice thick with tears. "You really did it." Martha joined them, sobbing openly, clutching both of their hands. Around them, even crew members and stagehands clapped, some discreetly, wiping at their own eyes. As Beatrice allowed herself to be swept into the whirlwind of congratulations and flashing cameras, something inside her shifted permanently. The voice of Professor Winters, so long a ghost in her mind, finally faded into irrelevance. In its place stood the truth. Not every dream dies. Some simply wait for us to be ready to claim them. And Beatrice Caldwell, ordinary and visible. Beatrice had just claimed hers in front of the whole world. The hotel room smelled faintly of lavender from the little sachets Martha had tucked into Beatrice's suitcase, a small comfort from home. The walls were a muted beige, the bed too soft, the windows overlooking a parking lot dotted with yellow streetlights. Beatrice stood barefoot on the carpet, still in the same flower-embroidered dress she had worn on stage, her hands trembling slightly as she scrolled through the screen of the borrowed smartphone Karen had pressed into her hand. She had never owned a smartphone before. She thought of herself as someone who still read printed maps, who wrote grocery lists on scraps of paper, who liked the feel of real books with cracked spine. Now in the palm of her hand, the whole world was rushing toward her at dizzying speed, notifications stacked on top of each other like frantic applause. Videos of her performance had been uploaded within minutes, flooding social media faster than any producer could control. "Mom," Karen said breathlessly from the bed, where she was perched cross-legged in her jeans and college sweatshirt. "Mom, look, 3 million views already." 3 million. She held up her own phone, displaying a flood of comments. Who is this angel? I'm sobbing. Real music is back. Beatrice Caldwell just healed something inside me I didn't even know was broken. Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart galloping like a wild horse. 3 million, she whispered, and climbing. Karen said, her voice thick with awe, and something else, something fierce and protective. You're trending everywhere. A knock at the door startled them both. Karen jumped up to answer, and there stood Ryan Matthews clutching a massive bouquet of sunflowers so bright they looked almost unreal under the dim hallway lights. His grin was sheepish, his suit slightly rumpled now, like someone who had just survived a hurricane they hadn't seen coming. Mrs. Caldwell, Ryan said, stepping carefully into the room and as Karen ushered him in. I wanted to personally congratulate you and to, he paused, searching for the right word, apologize. Beatrice raised an eyebrow, folding her hands calmly in front of her, apologize. Ryan's gaze flickered to Karen, then back to her, and he gave a short laugh, a crack appearing in his television, perfect persona. We thought you'd be a nice sympathy story, something sweet for the viewers to root for and then forget. We had no idea you were going to be this. Beatrice said nothing. She didn't need to. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, then thrust the flowers at her as though they might shield him. Also, he added quickly, 3 major record labels called today asking about you. 2 talk show producers want to book you, and he smiled thinly. America's Spotlight ratings last night, best we've had all season by far. Beatrice took the flowers, gently inhaling their bright, stubborn scent. She set them down carefully on the dresser before turning back to him. Thank you, Mr. Matthews, she said with a softness that somehow still sliced like steel. Sometimes being underestimated is the best advantage a person can have. Ryan chuckled, genuine this time, and shook his head. I'm starting to see that. He fished a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table. If you're willing, we'd love to have you back for the semifinals. America's already fallen in love with you. Now they want more. After he left, Beatrice sat heavily on the bed, her knees suddenly weak. Karen squeezed her hand tightly. Mom, she said, her voice low and urgent, you don't have to do anything you don't want to. This is your life. You can walk away right now if you want to. Beatrice looked at her daughter, the child she had raised through every storm and setback. The living proof that small, invisible acts of love were more powerful than anyone ever gave them credit for. She thought of the long years when her dreams had been folded away, packed neatly, behind duty and necessity. She thought of Richard gone too soon. She thought of all the times she had told herself it was too late. And then she smiled. I think, Beatrice said softly, I'm just getting started. The next morning, the world outside had changed entirely. Beatrice's name trended on every platform. Morning news programs ran clips of her performance, juxtaposing them against shiny manufactured pop acts with headlines like, Real talent at last, and age is just a number meet, America's new sweetheart. Karen's phone rang constantly, reporters, agents, distant relatives. Beatrice hadn't heard from in years. Some asked for interviews. Some simply wanted to say they were proud that they had cried watching her sing, that somehow she had reached into a quiet, broken place inside them and stitched something back together. While Karen fielded calls, Beatrice slipped into the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was the same and yet not. She was still soft around the edges, still wearing the same worn dress, still carrying the same wrinkles and silver hair. But her eyes were different, clearer. Stronger, full of a kind of fierce, quiet joy. The hotel had provided a modest breakfast buffet, and they sat together at a small corner table, eating scrambled eggs and toast while pretending not to notice the stares from other guests. A few even approached shyly for autographs, holding out napkins and hotel stationery as if she were a movie star. In the middle of buttering a slice of toast, her phone buzzed with a new text, an unknown number. Frowning slightly, Beatrice opened the message. Beatrice, it's Professor James Winters. I'm 92 now. Retired in Florida. I saw your performance. I was wrong all those years ago. Profoundly, unforgivably wrong. You were always extraordinary. I'm sorry. The fork slipped from her hand, clattering against the plate. Karen looked up sharply. Mom, everything okay? Beatrice swallowed hard, blinking back a sudden rush of tears. She turned the phone so Karen could see the message. Karen read it once, then again, her mouth falling open slightly. Is that? Beatrice nodded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Karen reached across the table and grasped her mother's hand tightly. See, she said, her voice trembling. You were never the problem. You never were. Beatrice laughed, a wet, choked sound that startled even herself. A laugh full of release, full of all the years she had carried that old wound without even realizing how heavy it had been. Later, back in the hotel room, she sat by the window watching the sunlight stretch long golden fingers across the asphalt. She thought of all the versions of herself that had led to this moment. The hopeful girl, the heartbroken young woman, the busy mother, the quiet volunteer, the reluctant contestant. All of them were still inside her. All of them had brought her here. Beatrice picked up her phone again, hesitated only a second, and typed a reply. Thank you, Professor Winters. I forgive you. I hope you find peace too. She pressed send, set the phone aside, and leaned back in the chair, feeling lighter than she had in years. There were still decisions to make. There would be contracts to negotiate, rehearsals to survive cameras. To brave the road ahead wasn't smooth or certain, but for the first time in a long time, it was hers to choose. At last. The rehearsal studio smelled of varnished wood and faint lingering cologne. Like a memory of all the songs sung here before her, Beatrice stood in the center of the wide empty space holding a microphone that felt heavier, now almost sacred. The stage lights were lowered, a soft amber glow touching the tops of her silver blonde curls. Her flowered dress had been swapped for something simpler, a deep blue blouse and tailored slacks that Martha had insisted she buy after their spontaneous shopping trip that morning. You're a star now, Martha had said, squeezing her shoulders. You need to dress like you already believe it. The producers had assigned her a vocal coach for the semifinals, a woman named Celeste, who wore sleek black outfits and always smelled faintly of cinnamon. Celeste was brisk but kind, pushing Beatrice through scales, tweaking phrasing, adjusting posture. For the first time in decades, Beatrice was not just singing for herself in secret corners. She was honing learning, stretching her voice towards something new. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. The semifinals would be broadcast live next Saturday night. Prime time, millions of viewers. No second chances. Beatrice had chosen her song carefully after much agonizing, You Don't Own Me, a bold, almost rebellious anthem that Karen had suggested during a late-night conversation filled with laughter and old memories. You're not their sympathy act, Mom, Karen had said fiercely. You're a storm they didn't see coming. Still doubts coiled in the corners of Beatrice's mind like smoke. Fame was a trickster goad and adoration was a fickle tile. She knew it could turn on her just as quickly as it had lifted her up. After rehearsal, she walked slowly back to her hotel, preferring the fresh spring air to the sterile chill of the black town car they had offered. Millfield had been quiet familiar. Here the city thrummed with energy, and everywhere she went now there were glances, whispers, smiles of recognition. Some made her heart swell, some made her shrink inward. At the corner near the hotel, she paused to watch a street musician playing a battered trumpet, the notes wild and sweet against the afternoon bustle. She dropped a few bills into the open case and the man winked at her. You're that lady from TV, ain't you? He said, grinning mob. I suppose I am, Beatrice said, feeling a strange flutter of disbelief even as the words left her mouth. Singing like the angels themselves, he said. Don't let 'em change you now. I'll try not to, she promised and meant it. In the lobby of the hotel, a cluster of strangers waited, fans who had somehow tracked her down, holding programs, napkins, even scraps of paper, asking breathlessly for autographs, selfies. Beatrice signed everything they handed her, smiling stunned. But inside, she felt like she was floating above herself, watching someone else move through this surreal new world. Back upstairs, Karen and Martha were waiting, both buzzing with nervous excitement. Karen was scrolling rapidly through social media, reading snippets of news articles aloud. CNN's running a profile on you tomorrow. The Times called you the voice of the forgotten generation. Martha bounced on the edge of the armchair, clutching a steaming cup of tea. And the church back home is throwing a watch party next weekend. Pastor William says he's reserving the fellowship hall and everything. Beatrice laughed, warm and breathless. Oh, Lord, help me, she murmured. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Karen opened it to reveal a young woman in a neatly pressed blazer, her expression crisp and professional. Mrs. Caldwell, she asked, stepping inside with the practiced ease of someone used to being obeyed. I'm Cassandra Green. I represent Vanguard Talent Management. I believe we can be very helpful to you moving forward. Beatrice blinked, taken aback. I haven't contacted any agencies. No, but they've contacted us, Cassandra said smoothly, handing over a glossy packet. With the level of attention you're generating, you need protection. Guidance branding. She said the last word with a little sparkle in her eye, like it was a secret handshake. Karen bristled immediately, sensing the predator beneath the polished exterior. We were just discussing things with Mom's legal advisor. She lied effortlessly. Of course, Cassandra said unperturbed. I just wanted to introduce myself, offer my card. We're selective about our clients, Mrs. Caldwell, but you're special. Beatrice took the card mechanically, her mind already buzzing with warning bells. Cassandra smiled all teeth and left with a little nod, her high heels clicking sharply down the hallway. Martha clucked her tongue as soon as the door clicked shut. She's like one of those sharks you see on nature shows. Smells blood, starts circling. Karen crossed her arms. We need to be careful, Mom. You don't owe anyone anything. Beatrice nodded slowly, staring at the card in her hand. She set it down on the nightstand without another glance. But Cassandra Green was only the first ripple of a deeper current. Within hours, rumors began circulating on the internet, whispers that Beatrice wasn't as wholesome as she seemed, that her small-town widow story had been manufactured for sympathy. An anonymous post claimed she had been a failed singer who gave up when she couldn't cut it. Another hinted that she had been planted by the producers all along, a manufactured viral sensation. The lies hit like blows, each one sharper, because they were so absurd and yet so easy to believe for people who wanted drama more than truth. Karen threw down her phone in disgust. This is disgusting. None of it's true. They're scared, Martha said wisely, patting Beatrice's hand. When people can't tear down what's real, they try to smear it. Beatrice said nothing for a long moment. Her hands trembled again, but not from fear this time. From anger, from clarity. I didn't come this far to let cowards with keyboards write my story, she said finally, her voice steady and low. That night, Beatrice recorded a short video in the hotel room. No makeup, no lights, just her sitting in front of the beige wall speaking directly into Karen's phone. My name is Beatrice Caldwell, she said simply. I'm 68 years old. I'm a widow, a mother, a singer. Everything you heard about me, the loneliness, the years of singing to an empty house, it's all true. And none of it makes me a victim. It makes me human. If you've ever been told you're too old, too late, too small, too broken, I'm here to tell you they're wrong. She paused, gathering herself. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be brave. And sometimes bravery sounds like a song sung in a voice that shakes. She smiled, then soft and radiant. Thank you for believing in me. I won't let you down. Karen uploaded the video to Beatrice's newly minted official page. Within an hour, it had over 100,000 shares. Within a day, it had over 10 million. The semifinals loomed just days away. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had Beatrice Caldwell. And this time, she wasn't stepping onto that stage alone. She was stepping there carrying everyone who had ever been overlooked, doubted, dismissed, and she would make sure the world heard her. Loud and clear, at last, the backstage corridors pulsed with tension, the air crackling with the kind of charged energy that only a live broadcast could summon. Technicians barked final checks into headsets, the scent of hairspray and sweat, and nervous excitement hanging thick in the air. Beatrice stood near the heavy black curtain that separated chaos from the glowing arena beyond, clutching the microphone they had handed her as if it were a lifeline. Around her, contestants buzzed, young dancers stretching nervous muscles, singers murmuring scales under their breath, a juggler spinning knives through the air like silver fish. Beatrice barely registered any of it. She smoothed her dark blue blouse, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes, finding the still place inside her where Richard's voice lived, where Karen's laughter echoed, where all the quiet mornings and small, hard-won triumphs of her life had stacked up like stones forming a cathedral. No one else could see. She remembered Zoe's voice backstage after her first performance. Blow them away. Church lady. She smiled faintly at the memory. Tonight wasn't about survival. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. Tonight was about standing fully in the light. No apologies, no diminishment. The host's voice boomed out into the cavernous studio, polished and bright. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for a performance that proves you don't need youth to ignite a spark. You just need soul. Please welcome back to the stage, Beatrice Caldwell. The audience roared a wall of sound that hit her like a physical force. Beatrice stepped forward onto the gleaming stage, heart pounding but head clear, each step deliberate. The lights were blinding again, turning faces into a sea of blurred silhouettes, but she felt the energy of them, their breathless hope, their wide-open hearts. The band struck the first bold, defiant chords of You Don't Own Me. It was a risk she knew that people might have expected another gentle ballad, something grandmotherly and sweet. But she hadn't come to be sweet. She had come to be true. Her voice burst forth steady and strong, slicing cleanly through the expectant silence. You don't own me. I'm not just one of your many toys. A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Beatrice smiled inwardly, feeling it the shift. The way the entire room leaned in, realizing this wasn't going to be what they had expected. She moved across the stage with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Not rehearsed, not choreographed, but born from something deeper. A lifetime of being told to sit down, to be quiet, to not make waves. Tonight she would be an ocean. In the control room, Ryan Matthews and his team watched in stunned silence. The monitor feed showed the audience open-mouthed, rising to their feet long before the song had even reached its crescendo. Producers scrambled to adjust camera angles to capture the moment as it bloomed into something bigger than anything they had engineered. On stage, Beatrice's voice grew stronger, with each line fueled by the gathering storm of the audience's reaction. She wasn't a performer executing a set list. She was a woman tearing down invisible cages brick by brick, note by note. And don't tell me what to do, and don't tell me what to say. In the front row, the judges sat transfixed. The pop star judge had tears running freely down her carefully contoured cheeks, her hand pressed to her heart. The veteran producer nodded slowly as if acknowledging something ancient and sacred. Even the youngest judge, the one who had once doubted her, stood up midway through the song, hands clapping high above his head. Beatrice didn't see them. She didn't see the camera zooming closer, didn't hear the audience beginning to shout her name. All she saw was a little girl with a music box and a dream. All she heard was the truth ringing out of her own chest. As she sang the final verse, she lifted her arms wide, as if to embrace the whole world, and the power of it lifted her, transformed her, made her bigger than her fears, bigger than their expectations, bigger than the story they had written for her. I'm free to live my life the way I want. The final note soared, held strong and pure, vibrating through every corner of the auditorium. For one impossibly long second, the world held its breath, and then it exploded. The standing ovation was instantaneous and thunderous. People stomped their feet, screamed her name, threw their arms in the air. The judges climbed onto the judges' table, pumping their fists, laughing and crying all at once. The host rushed onto the stage, nearly tripping in his haste. Ladies and gentlemen, Beatrice Caldwell, he shouted into his microphone, but the roar of the crowd nearly drowned him out. Beatrice stood in the center of it all, blinking against the bright lights, overwhelmed but radiant, her hands trembling, not with fear but with exhilaration. Karen and Martha hugged each other fiercely in the wings, tears streaming down their faces. Ryan Matthews leaned heavily against the control room wall, his headset slipping askew, staring at the screen with something close to awe. We just witnessed history, he muttered almost to himself. The pop singer judge took the microphone first when the host finally barely managed to restore some order. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Beatrice, you didn't just sing that song. You embodied it. You are that song. You just set a fire in here that none of us will ever forget. The veteran producer leaned into his microphone next, his voice rough with emotion. You are a force, ma'am, not a memory, not a sympathy story, a force. The young judge simply held up both hands in surrender. You win, hands down, no contest. Beatrice laughed soft and disbelieving, and when she spoke into her microphone, her voice trembled, but with joy this time. Thank you, she said. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for believing that it's never too late. The audience roared again, even louder if possible. As she was led gently off the stage, Beatrice passed Zoe, the young woman with purple hair and silver piercings who had snuck backstage to watch. Zoe clutched her hand fiercely. You burned the whole place down. Church lady, Zoe whispered. Eyes shining, Beatrice squeezed her hand, back her heart so full it felt almost too big for her chest. In the dressing room afterward, amidst the chaos of congratulations and flashing cameras, her phone buzzed. Another message, Beatrice Caldwell. You've just secured a record deal if you want it. Call me Universal Records? She stared at the screen, laughing in disbelief. Martha fanned herself dramatically with a program. Karen sat beside her, clutching her hand. You're a phenomenon now, Mom, Karen whispered. No, Beatrice said, her voice soft but sure. I'm just finally singing with my whole heart. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the world was singing back. The city at night hummed with a low electric pulse. From the window of her suite, Beatrice could see the skyline stretched out before her, glass towers shimmering like distant stars, traffic threading its restless way through the dark like veins pulsing with life. She stood there barefoot on the cool carpet, still wearing the deep blue gown she had performed in, too wired, too alive to even think of changing. Her reflection in the glass startled her. Silver hair, flushed cheeks, eyes alight with something she hadn't seen in herself for decades, fierce, undeniable joy. Behind her, Karen and Martha sat curled on the sofa, giddy and exhausted, trading news updates and screen captures from social media. Every platform buzzed with her name. Hashtags, trending, articles, fan pages. They read the headlines aloud in disbelief, laughing at how surreal it all seemed. America's new icon. Karen read, shaking her head. They're calling you the voice that saved the season. Save the season, Beatrice said, laughing, pressing a hand over her heart. Mercy, I was just trying to make it through the song without fainting. Martha clucked her tongue, leaning forward. You didn't just make it through, you conquered that stage. You made every single person in that room believe in something again. Their joy wrapped around Beatrice like a warm blanket, and for a while she let herself bask in it, the simple miracle of being seen, of being heard, of being enough exactly as she was. But as the night stretched on and the city settled deeper into its sleepless rhythm, a new kind of tension began to creep into the corners of her mind. The finals were less than 2 weeks away. The stakes would be higher, the scrutiny sharper, and somewhere behind the adulation, Beatrice could already feel the familiar chill of envy, of resistance. Not everyone was thrilled by her unexpected ascent. The first real warning came the next afternoon. Beatrice had just finished a casual interview with a local news outlet, something easy and friendly, where she spoke about her love of music, her late husband Richard, her daughter Karen, when Ryan Matthews intercepted her backstage, his face tight with forced politeness. We need to talk, he said under his breath, steering her toward an empty side corridor lined with equipment cases. Beatrice followed, a knot forming in her stomach. Listen, Ryan began, glancing around to make sure they were alone. Some of the other contestants will, there's talk. Talk, she echoed cautiously. Whispers, he said, shifting uncomfortably. That maybe you've had professional training, that maybe you're not just some sweet grandmother from Ohio? Beatrice stared at him, stunned. Are you accusing me of something? Ryan raised his hands quickly. Not me, but it's out there now. Blogs are picking it up. Fans of the younger contestants feel like you're getting special treatment. They're upset. Beatrice's first instinct was disbelief, then almost immediately hurt. After everything, after years of bearing her voice, of living a life too small for the dreams she once dared to have, now that she finally dared to step forward, people wanted to tear her down. I never hid anything, she said quietly. I told you the truth. I sang in church choirs. I sang to my daughter, that's all. Ryan nodded, rubbing a hand through his hair. I believe you. But in this business, perception matters almost as much as reality. And if this keeps growing, it could hurt your chance in the final. Beatrice folded her arms, feeling the old defenses rising, the ones built over decades of swallowing. Disappointment of enduring slights too small to name, but too large to forget. What do you want me to do? She asked. Ryan hesitated. Maybe downplay things in your interviews. Stick to simple, safe answers. Focus on the emotion, not your story. Don't give them any ammunition. Beatrice thought of the girl she once was, trembling in Professor Winter's office and accepting his verdict as gospel truth. She thought of the years she spent apologizing for taking up space, for dreaming too loudly, and she thought of the woman who had stood on that stage and made an entire country listen. No, she said firmly. Ryan blinked. No, I won't lie, Beatrice said. I won't shrink myself down again. If people are uncomfortable with who I am, that's their burden to carry, not mine. For a moment, they stared at each other, two very different worlds colliding. Then Ryan exhaled a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. You're something else, Mrs. Caldwell. So I've been told, she said dryly, and walked away before he could say another word. That night after dinner with Karen and Martha, Beatrice sat alone on the tiny hotel balcony, wrapped in a soft shawl against the cool breeze. The city spread out before her, glittering and vast, and for the first time she allowed herself to think seriously about what lay beyond the competition. Record deals, tours, albums. None of it had been part of the life she'd imagined for herself even 2 months ago. Was she ready for it? Could she even survive it at her age with her quiet habits and her stubborn heart? Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. Another text. You inspire me, Beatrice. Don't let them change you, Zoe. She smiled, touched. The younger singer had continued to send little messages of encouragement ever since their first conversation backstage. Before she could respond, another notification popped up, a news article this time. Anonymous source claims, Beatrice Caldwell's past, not as innocent as it seems. Beatrice clicked on it with trembling hands. The article dredged up ancient, irrelevant details. A college music scholarship she had once turned down after Professor Winter's brutal critique. A brief attempt at singing with a local band during her 20s that had ended before it ever truly began. None of it was scandalous, none of it was dishonest, but framed a certain way, it fed the narrative of betrayal. Karen found her on the balcony minutes later. Her face grim. I saw it too. She said, Mom, we don't have to engage. We don't have to explain anything to anyone. Beatrice turned the phone face down on the table. She looked at her daughter, the child she had sung to sleep through dark nights, the child she had taught to stand up even when her knees shook, and she made a decision. I'm not going to fight them, she said softly. I'm going to outshine them, Karen's eyes filled with tears. You always do, she whispered. The days leading up to the final were a whirlwind. Interviews, rehearsals, meetings with stylists who suggested glitter, and gowns that Beatrice firmly declined. She would take the stage exactly as she was. No costumes, no gimmicks, just her voice, her heart, her truth. The producers tried to push her towards safer song choices, classics that would wrap the audience in nostalgia and sadness, but Beatrice knew what she wanted. She would sing Rise Up by Andra Day, a song about resilience, about dignity, about hope, clawed back from the edge of despair. When she stood at the edge of that final stage, the lights dimming, the murmuring crowd fading into darkness, Beatrice closed her eyes one last time. She didn't pray for success. She prayed for courage, and then she stepped forward, into the light, into the fight, into her life at last. The silence before the first note was heavier than anything Beatrice had ever known. It wasn't the silence of fear or hesitation. It was the silence of thousands of people holding their breath together, of hope so thick it bent the air. She stood alone on the massive stage, a single spotlight bathing her in warm gold, making her seem both small and infinite at once. Her hands steady now cradled the microphone as if it were an old friend. The orchestra behind her waited poised like a held breath. She wore a simple dress tonight. One Karen had helped her pick a flowing, navy blue, elegant, but unpretentious, with a small silver pin at the shoulder shaped like a dove. No glitter, no dazzling theatrics. Just her. Just Beatrice. The opening chords of Rise Up bloomed from the orchestra, soft and stirring, and Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over. She thought of Richard, of the small house back in Millfield, of mornings filled with crossword puzzles and coffee, of nights humming lullabies to a child she had raised alone. She thought of every quiet sacrifice no one had ever applauded, of every small courage that had gone unseen, and then she sang. The first words slipped from her lips like a prayer, low, trembling with weight and truth. You're broken down and tired. Her voice filled the vast auditorium, not with volume but with gravity, pulling every ear, every heart closer. She sang each line not as a performer but as a witness, as someone who had lived each lyric, carried it in the marrow of her bones. When she reached the chorus, her voice rose not in manufactured bravado, but in a swell of raw, aching strength that sent shivers through the crowd. And I'll rise up in spite of the ache. The camera operators, seasoned professionals who had seen 1,000 shows, stood rooted behind their equipment, mouths parted in awe. The judges didn't even pretend to take notes this time. They sat, frozen eyes locked on her, undone by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. At home, across the country, millions of viewers sat riveted in living rooms and bedrooms and hospital wards and truck cabs pulled over by highways. They saw not a polished starlet, not a packaged product, but a woman who had lived, who had lost, who had dared to hope again. Beatrice's voice climbed higher, cracked slightly, and the crack was perfect. It was the sound of surviving, of refusing to surrender to bitterness, of daring to love the world, even when it broke you. The second chorus came like a wave, lifting her, lifting everyone. I'll rise up 1,000 times again. And as she held the final note, the world seemed to blur around her. For a moment, it was just her and the music and the staggering, overwhelming beauty of being alive. When the last note fell away into silence, the moment stretched out longer than it should have, longer than protocol dictated, as if no one dared to breathe, to move, to shatter the fragile, shimmering thing they had all just witnessed. Then, like a dam breaking, the studio erupted. The audience surged to their feet, roaring her name, clapping so hard it hurt. People wept openly, strangers clinging to each other, swept away by a force too vast for words. Even backstage, staff and crew members wiped their eyes, exchanging glances of astonishment. On stage, Beatrice stood with tears brimming in her own eyes, stunned by the tidal wave of love crashing toward her. The host appeared at her side, his usual smooth confidence replaced by something raw and genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that," he said, his voice thick. The judges rushed to speak. The veteran producer leaned into his microphone, shaking his head slowly. "Beatrice, you didn't just sing tonight. You brought us all back to life." The pop singer judge dabbed at her eyes, voice trembling. "You showed every single person watching that there's no expiration date on dreams, no limit on grace." And then, unexpectedly, the youngest judge stood and spoke, his voice breaking. "My mom, she's fighting cancer right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight you sang for her, for all of us, thank you." Beatrice pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed beyond speech. The host smiled at her warmly. "Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the final vote, but I think we already know who won our hearts tonight." The voting lines opened, the crowd still shouting her name backstage. Beatrice collapsed into Karen's arms, sobbing with relief, with release, with joy so fierce it left her trembling. "You did it, Mom," Karen whispered fiercely, hugging her tighter than she ever had as a child. "You did it, no." Beatrice managed, voice thick, "We did." The minutes that followed were a blur. Interviews, lights, congratulatory handshakes, and tearful hugs from strangers. Martha sobbing into a tissue, repeating over and over, "I knew it, I always knew it." When the final announcement came, it didn't feel real at first. And America's Spotlight champion, Beatrice Caldwell. Confetti rained from the ceiling in a dazzling blizzard of gold and silver. Music swelled. The crowd roared so loudly it seemed the very walls might shake. Beatrice staggered onto the stage again, barely able to see through her tears. The trophy they handed her felt almost irrelevant, a pretty symbol of something much deeper she had already claimed. She lifted it high, laughing, crying radiant. For a long, breathtaking moment, the world belonged not to youth or glamour or slick packaging, but to truth, to resilience, to a woman who had dared to rise. 2 weeks later, Beatrice sat on the porch of her small home in Millfield, Ohio, the spring sun warming her face, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. The world had not stopped spinning. Dishes still needed washing. Bills still arrived in the mail. But everything had changed. Her first album was already in pre-production. A small tour was being planned. Churches, small theaters, community centers, places where her songs could reach people who needed them most. She had said no to the big marketing teams who wanted to airbrush her story to smooth out her rough edges. She refused to become a brand. She chose instead to remain exactly who she was, flawed human. Glorious, her phone buzzed beside her, a message from Zoe. "Can I open for you on the tour? Even just once would be an honor." Beatrice grinned, her heart swelling. "Of course," she typed back. "Bring your fire." Karen emerged from the house carrying 2 mugs. She set one down beside her mother and sat down with a sigh of pure contentment. "You ready for all this, Mom?" she asked. Beatrice watched a pair of sparrows dart through the budding trees, the wind lifting their wings. "I think," she said softly, "I've been ready for a long, long time. I just needed to remember." They sat together in the warm Ohio sunlight, sipping coffee, letting the breeze carry away the last remnants of old doubts. Beatrice closed her eyes, listening. Not to the roar of a crowd, not to the whispers of critics, but to the simple, steady music of her own heart, still beating, still singing, still rising at last.